Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison, and I want to welcome you to day 188 of Humanity Rising. Yesterday, we delved into the area of public health and mental health. And the point was made that social problems create health problems, and that the response to the pandemic around the world by our governments has been sufficiently chaotic and disorganized, not only in the United States, but worldwide, as we've dealt with a pandemic that has really challenged us in ways that humanity's never been challenged before. It's the first time in history that everybody everywhere on planet Earth went through the same experience at the same time. And there was severe contractions in our economies, as you all know, lockdowns, physical distancing, and all kinds of measures taken as the world groped for how to best deal with a pandemic that has proven itself a year later to be remarkably resilient and persistent, and is coming up with new variants every week in different parts of the world. And there are vaccinations, of course, that are beginning to be rolled out. But one of the other points that was made in the session yesterday is that they're discovering that it is hope, simple hope in the future, that is empowering people and strengthening people's immune systems and giving people the wherewithal internally, in terms of the intestinal fortitude, as they put it, to cope with social situations and physical situations and health situations that are challenging all of us in an ongoing way. Before we launch into our program today, and in the spirit of knowing that we need to take care of ourselves from the inside out as the most fundamental way of empowering ourselves through this pandemic, let us pause, as we do every day, for just a minute or two of heart coherence. I invite you to just take a few deep breaths, settle yourself in your body. Close your eyes if you can, and place your attention on your heart. See if you can just simply attune and listen to your heartbeat in a spirit of gratitude and thanksgiving that you're alive at this extraordinary moment. Thank you, everyone. Now, with an open heart and a heart deeply grateful for each and every one of you who are joining our program today, I want to make some introductory remarks coming out of our heart coherence meditation just now. When you attune yourself to your own heart and sometimes attune yourself to the heartbeat of others. We can also attune ourselves to the electromagnetic pulsing of the earth. Heart coherence activates empathy. It activates a sense of connection. It activates love. The more you engage in heart coherence, the more you experience loving compassion for the interconnected world in which we all find ourselves. So today we want to explore more deeply the compassion of empathy, the science of empathy, what goes on when we feel love, when we experience heart coherence, when we feel the suffering of the world and those around us, and we feel deep empathy. What happens? Well, we're very fortunate today to have Professor Jordan Quaglia with us. He's the professor of applied psychology at Naropa University. He directs their Institute for Cognitive and Affective Science. He's been on the program before. You'll remember he was very impressive in dealing with some of the aspects of meditation and mindfulness several months ago. So we have invited him back for a deeper dive. So Jordan, I am very pleased to invite you to present your findings and your thoughts and reflections on compassion for empaths. And then once Jordan has finished his presentation, I'll circle back and we'll have a dialogue, which will include the various comments and questions that many of you will put in the chat box. So Jordan, welcome.
Thank you, Jim. Good morning, everyone. Here from a snowy yet sunny Boulder, Colorado, where I am. It's nice to be here with you all again to join this session. And I'm excited to share today some of my own research, some of my own thinking about a topic that I've become quite passionate about, which is this fairly popular term of empath. This is a term that people use often to self-identify themselves as someone who is a little bit higher on empathy. And sometimes it's even to such a degree that there's kind of an instantaneous feeling what others are feeling. So we're going to go into a little bit more what that might mean from a scientific perspective. And the thing that I'm really passionate about is this idea that compassion science has some things to say about what it's like to be an empath and how we might use that quality, that strength of ours to support ourselves and others in the world. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now and we'll get started. This is going to be a PowerPoint presentation here. All right. So as I said, this is a fairly popular term, empath. Maybe you've heard it before. Maybe some of you that are watching self-identify in this kind of way. But what really is meant by an empath? To my knowledge, as someone who does research in this field of empathy and compassion, there's not to date really a clear scientific consensus on what it means to be an empath. So that's the first thing to note, is that an empath isn't such a specific term. It's not been clarified so much scientifically to date. We do know from studying empathy and from studying compassion that certain people, there's natural variation in empathy within the population. And certain people then score higher than others on different empathy measures. And if you study their brain, they have a stronger empathic response to different kinds of situations and so on. And so there is this kind of natural variation in empathy that we can point to, with some people falling higher on that range, including, interestingly, there's some rare outliers with regard to this kind of experience called mirror touch synesthesia. These are individuals who experience kind of the mirror of what they're watching and observing in others. So if they see someone touched on the cheek, for example, their brain lights up in a very similar fashion. And all of us, we know that there's a natural spectrum of this. Almost everyone has this kind of mirror neuron aspect to how their brain is functioning and how they're processing social stimuli, how they're observing others and taking in that information and simulating it within their own experience. But there are, again, there's a dimension here, and there are these rare outliers of mirror touch synesthetes that tend to experience this to a somewhat more extreme degree. Should we then therefore say that empaths only, the term empath only applies to that sort of extreme upper range of mirror touch synesthete? I don't think so. I think it's helpful for us to take a somewhat broader approach to what an empath is. On the other hand, we could get too broad with our understanding of what an empath is, where it's sort of just anything and everything goes. For example, we know that emotional contagion is a close cousin of empathy. Is it the case that we should consider someone high in emotional contagion to be an empath as well? So these are some of the sort of ways that I like to think about what an empath is. There's some kind of range, there's some kind of cutoff. But for me personally, as a scientist, I get a little bit grumpy, you might say. Anytime that we're trying to sort of take something that's a dimension, that's a matter of degree, and make some kind of category out of that. Because when we do that, we sort of box ourselves in or box other people in. So another example of this might be an extrovert. I think we all understand that it's a bit more complicated than that. Some people are more extroverted in some situations than others. And yet we can sort of point to certain individuals probably in our life, maybe even ourselves, and say, yeah, those people are pretty clearly higher on the extroversion dimension. They're pretty clearly an extrovert, right? So there's sort of these clear examples. But what about somebody that's more on the edge of that? What about someone who's an extrovert in many situations, but an introvert in other situations? So I think there's a kind of similar dance that we need to take, an approach that we need to take with regard to what an empath is, in the sense that we should consider it probably more of a degree thing. And yes, there's a certain point in empathy where we might sort of arbitrarily make that cutoff and say someone is an empath. So for the purposes of today's discussion, I want to sort of frame it quite broadly as an empath is someone who self-identifies in this way, someone who experiences themselves as having a high degree of empathy. And it's worth noting here that an empath is kind of a double-edged sword. Typically how this is discussed in popular culture, and if you read books about empaths and so on, there's this double-edged sword quality to it, where being an empath has these upsides. It is a strength in the sense that there's this stronger empathy, and that makes maybe being more intuitive and understanding and caring is more readily available to people who are empaths. But there's also these downsides, and that may depend on sort of external factors. If we wanted to get kind of an experiential sense for an empath, I could show you a couple images here. And if you have a strong reaction to these images, you're sort of feeling this and in a way that maybe makes you a little bit dysregulated, it's hard to look at these images. Maybe you would score higher on empathy. Maybe you might self-identify as an empath in this way if it's quite difficult, challenging for you to take in the emotions of others or to experience that so readily available and intense for you that sometimes it is experienced as a burden. So we can sort of clean the slate here. So this is a good way of thinking about also the upsides, right, of this, is if we're around people who are in a more joyful state, then we have this resonance with them, this empathic joy. And so in that situation, being an empath might lead to higher well-being and so on. So a lot of it may depend on the external factors, who we're with, who we're spending time with, how empathic they are, and so on. One more factor here that I'd like us to consider is this sort of larger trend that we're seeing within society. Now, this is all the way just up until 2009. Unfortunately, this publication was published in 2011. Unfortunately, I've tried to find a more recent updated study like this, and it doesn't appear that anything's been replicated in this way. But here you can see, using the same measure of empathy, starting in 1979, you see this pretty clear marked decline in empathy within society. And to put this decline in context, it actually outpaces the increase in narcissism that we're seeing during the same time window, same time period. So this decline in empathy is non-trivial. I think it matters for how we're functioning as a society and a species. And if we think about what it means to be an empath in this context, then we might understand that it may be increasingly important for empaths to distinguish themselves in a society where empathy is on the decline. So understanding that empathy is situated and that our relationship to our own empathy may vary depending on context. If the national trend is in this direction of decline, maybe we have actually a sort of normal level of empathy compared to what would have been normal in the 90s. But now in this context, we're experiencing ourselves sort of increasingly as an outlier because of this decline in empathy. And I'd be interested to see whether this sort of downtrend continues. I suspect it would, given the kind of increased polarization and so on within society. So I think that maybe being an empath, the reason that it's growing in popularity, I find, at least here in Boulder, that this term is pretty popular, maybe that people are needing to sort of identify themselves in this way, kind of come out of the empathy closet, so to speak, and find their tribe, find other people who are also identifying in this way, because there's these downsides potentially that come with too much empathy, or that you might experience yourself as having too much empathy. So we can get a little more specific, though, with regard to what an empath is by considering empathy. What is empathy from a scientific perspective? So here again, there's not such clear scientific consensus on what empathy is. Different researchers use this term in different ways, and different people use this term in different ways. And you might find this yourself. You use the term empathy quite broadly or generally. And maybe you've even asked yourself, what do I mean exactly by empathy? You know, and things like emotional contagion, is that empathy as well? So fortunately, within science, we sort of figured out, Jamil Zaki at Stanford University wrote this nice paper showing that generally people mean three different kinds of things when they refer to empathy. So mind perception is this kind of more basic level of empathy, the sense that another person has a mind. And so one way that I like to think about this is that some of us think that trees have minds and some of us don't, right? So mind perception is kind of obvious when we think about that. Some people will attribute a mind to a tree and some people will not. And that is in itself a kind of empathy. We can have empathy for a tree if we think that a tree has a mind. But if we don't think a tree has a mind, or another plant or an animal, then we're less likely to experience these other kinds of empathy. Experience sharing is the most common form of use of the term empathy. And this is our tendency for our nervous systems to take on the states of other nervous systems that we encounter. And so we know from research that this is mediated by bodily cues. So when we see people's facial expressions and when we see their bodily posture and so on, even hear the tone of their voice, we simulate that experience within our own body and mind. And that causes us to move more in the direction of whatever state they're in. There can be exceptions to this, but this is the kind of way that we understand this process to work, is there's this kind of automatic and subconscious simulation taking place within our brains, within our minds, within our hearts of other people's states, and we tend to move toward that and share in the experience of what others are experiencing. This final category here, mentalizing, is a more cognitive form of empathy. And so that's not a bad distinction to make as well, is between emotional empathy, which has more to do with this experience sharing aspect, and then cognitive empathy, which is our ability to think ourselves into other people's situations, to make sense of what they might be going through. So these can work in tandem, right? We can experience vicariously the sadness of another, and we ourselves experience that empathically on an emotional level. And then we might come up with a storyline of why we think that they're feeling sad, and we might check that out with them and ask them questions and so on, as a form of more cognitive empathy. Okay, so for this presentation, for as far as I think about an empath, and I'm not saying this is scientific consensus, but I tend to think of an empath as being more about this middle piece here, experience sharing. What we might say is more emotional empathy, this tendency to take on other states. It happens relatively automatically, and it can happen independent of the cognitive empathy. In fact, people might be quite good or experience quite strongly emotional empathy, but not be as good at cognitive empathy, and vice versa. And so these are dissociable dimensions of empathy. And so I tend to think of empaths as someone who scores higher specifically on this experience sharing dimension. Okay, now what's important to understand then when I refer to empathy throughout the remainder of this talk is I'm largely referring then to this kind of experience sharing, and I'll distinguish when I'm meaning something else. So what's important to understand about experience sharing is that it tends to be relatively automatic. We know that this kind of automatic experience sharing is a really important aspect of social connection. It's a kind of social glue. You can experience this yourself if you have a friend and you decide to kind of partner up and try out this exercise of listening to the other person share something, potentially something stressful they're going through. Mildly stressful is the best way to practice this, and to try to not respond, try to not nod, try and withhold saying anything. It's very difficult to do that. So that shows that this experience sharing dimension is quite automatic. It's occurring beneath the surface of conscious awareness. And we'll get into more of how that applies in the context of empaths in a moment, but it's really important to understand that our sense of social connection depends a lot on the sense of emotional connection that is made available through this automatic experience sharing. So, for example, if I show you an image like this, you might immediately pick up on some of the feeling state of this baby, right? So there's a sort of this immediate heartfelt quality to that. And so that demonstrates the sort of automaticity. You're not thinking, oh, I need to resonate with this baby here. You're instead experiencing that, most of us experiencing that as a kind of automatic process that's occurring beneath the surface of conscious awareness. And this is, again, going to be very important to our understanding of where we're going here. On the other side, in social situations, we have this need. Ignore what's on the left for now, just for a moment, just you can pay attention to the photo here. We have this need for also experiencing a differentiation of self and other, for experiencing our emotions as our emotions and other people's emotions as other people's emotions. And so we have a need, you could say, for a kind of emotional autonomy and emotional differentiation. And when we don't have this, when it's not present, we can experience some downsides, like a collapse of self into other, a sense of merging or dissolving in ways that cause us to feel like we lose ourselves. And maybe even that we sort of lose touch with the capacity to stay connected to others, because now that we're dissolved into kind of one unified experience, there's actually less potential for intimacy in that space, right? So what's here on the left now, we can kind of take a closer look at this chart, is this idea that we do have a little bit of control over our empathy. And this is a pretty complicated chart here, so we're not going to go over it in detail. But suffice it to say, this is again by Jamil Zaki, who I quite appreciate his perspective on empathy, showing that there's this ability to control empathy that may depend on our goals in different situations. So if we feel like empathy is going to be costly to us or others, we may choose to try and avoid the empathy experience. Whereas if we're trying to build relationship, build connection that is aligned with our goals, then we're going to approach the experience of empathy. We're going to try and experience empathy more. And that this all being said, there is this sort of ability to move toward or away from our empathy experience. There are limits to this. So research shows that certain aspects of empathy, especially in the experience sharing aspect, they are irrepressible. So even when you give people complex math to do, a complex math problem to do, that's not that is their goal, is to do well on that math, and then you sort of show them images that may lead to this experience sharing of other people in emotional states or whatever, their brains still show that they're resonating and detecting the internal states of others and simulating that experience in ways similar to how they would if they were not doing this math problem in their head. So this speaks again to the automaticity of this. It's occurring beneath the surface of conscious awareness, such that our conscious mind can be engaged by other things. It could be distracted. We could be trying to distract ourselves, trying to reduce our experience of empathy, and not succeeding in this effort, right? So this is this kind of irrepressible aspect. And this is important to understand because what research shows is that a lot of times people hire in empathy as well as helping professionals who also tend to choose those professions because of their empathic tendencies experience empathy fatigue. Now, this is sometimes referred to, often actually, referred to as compassion fatigue in the scientific literature and in applied settings. And as a researcher, I disagree with that way of languaging this experience. It tends to be that this isn't a symptom of compassion or too much compassion, excess compassion. Instead, it's more consistent with an understanding of empathy and the way that empathy can lead to fatigue over time. I'm not alone in this. Other researchers have pointed this out, and there are whole papers, book chapters, and so on written on why we should be calling this empathy fatigue instead of compassion fatigue. And we'll see more in a little bit about why that might be an important distinction to make. The thing I want to highlight here is that empathy fatigue isn't just the result of having a high degree of empathy. Someone could have a high degree of empathy and work in helping professions and not experience empathy fatigue. So it's not just about how high our empathy is. It's not that if we are an empath, we're sort of doomed to experience empathy fatigue within society, and especially if we work in helping professions where we're encountering the suffering of others on a regular basis. It is actually maybe more so a symptom of our misguided attempts to try and repress our empathy, to try and distract ourselves and avoid the experience of empathy. That's quite a costly thing to do, mentally costly. It takes a lot of mental effort, and as we've shown, it's irrepressible. So even when we try and do that, we tend to not succeed. And so then we're experiencing not just the extreme effort of trying, mental effort to try and avoid the experience of empathy, but then also a sort of emotion regulation failure because we're not able to actually control and reduce our empathy in the way consistent with what we were hoping. So this raises, I think, some important questions about the sort of downsides of being an empath and what someone might be able to do to sort of decrease this experience of empathy fatigue. Ultimately, right, we want to preserve the upsides of being an empath, of having high empathy or even normal levels of empathy, while reducing the downsides. We want to be able to experience both connection and containment, emotional connection and emotional containment. Could say emotional relatedness, and emotional autonomy. So is there something that we can do as empaths, as people who are high in empathy or even normal levels of empathy to move us more toward the middle. If this was a spectrum of not being too much on the side of emotional connection that we lose touch with ourselves, and not being so much on the side of emotional autonomy that we build walls and we sort of try and avoid the experience of our interdependence. So that's the basic question here, right? Is there something that empaths can do to reduce the downsides of their heightened empathy while preserving its upsides? In other words, is there something that allows us to experience containment and connection together, rather than as being something that that they're opposed to each other? And this is when we get into lessons from compassion science. And here we're going to be talking now about the shift from empathy to compassion. Empathy, as we've already said, is more about feeling with others. This is this experience sharing aspect. And then, as we'll see, compassion is going to be more about feeling for others. Now, importantly, these are not such distinct things. Compassion includes empathy. So we're not talking about a totally, wholly different experience than empathy. We're instead talking about compassion, and the way that I think about compassion is that it's completing the loop. We'll see what I mean by that in a little bit here. This is the way that we talk about compassion in our compassion trainings at Europa University as well. That compassion takes empathy as its starting point, in particular empathy for suffering, and then goes beyond that, actually, to experience a more conscious, regulated state. And we'll talk about then compassion can be thought maybe of as a kind of conscious, more conscious form of empathy, a more regulated form of empathy. Just to note, in case people are wondering about this, empathy is also a bit broader than compassion. Compassion specifically applies to the context of human suffering, or suffering more broadly, whereas empathy can also be for things like joy and so on. So here I'm mainly speaking about the distinction between empathy for suffering and compassion. So that's just a little thing to note in case that's coming up for any of you. So then what is compassion? How can we better understand this? What we're going to do in the time remaining here for my piece is we're going to talk about what compassion is at a more conceptual level in terms of its distinction. We may even get to some neuroscience data about that. And we're also going to try out within our own lived experience, see if we can feel in to this distinction between empathy and compassion ourselves here this morning. So the way that I think about compassion is consistent with others in the field as having these three primary elements. And the first of these elements is greater awareness of suffering. So when we're in a compassionate state, we are paying more attention to suffering within our own lived experience or within the experience of others, or paying attention to suffering that's happening in the world. We're actually willing, there's a kind of fearlessness, you could say, in compassion that's embedded in it, to lean into and to approach suffering. We're not doing the habitual thing that most of us have been conditioned to do, I think, which is that when suffering's occurring, to try and avoid or reject that experience. And this includes suffering within ourselves. We might dissociate from pain. We might go numb to our experience of suffering. So compassion is inverting that. We are actually being willing to lean in and take a look at the suffering that's there. The second piece of compassion is this greater feeling for the one who is suffering. What do I mean by that, feeling for? Well, we're going to experience this in a little bit, but often people experience this affective dimension of compassion as a kind of inner warmth. There's this experience that we kind of have this natural affection well up within us. We feel this kind of other-oriented state, although we can also apply this to ourselves. So there's an emotion, but the emotion is for something. It's for the one who is suffering. And this emotion, again, is kind of natural affection and inner warmth. And then the last piece here is this motivation or intention or willingness to alleviate the suffering if possible. So this is experienced in different ways in compassion. Sometimes it manifests itself in action. We're actually willing to take action on behalf of the one who is suffering to try and alleviate or reduce that suffering. But it's not always experienced that way. Sometimes it's more of an internal thing, that there's just this readiness to do something to alleviate the suffering if the opportunity presents itself. And there's this kind of inner wish. In the context of compassion practice, we experience this as a wish for the well-being of others, a wish for them to feel alleviated or some relief from their suffering. So yes, compassion can involve more external action, but it need not. We can experience compassion as an inner state on its own, and we can complete the loop, so to speak, of empathy to compassion without having to even leave our homes. And so this is important for understanding the practices of compassion as well. So notice that all three of these aspects pertain to suffering. So there's a cognitive, an affective, and a conative or intentional, that's what that word means, aspect. And they all pertain to the experience of suffering. And so who compassion is directed toward has to do with whose suffering is the sort of target of compassion, so to speak. So we can target our own suffering with compassion. We can shine that warmth on ourselves, and we can experience more self-compassion. And we can target that on another, a single person, or many others, or a more abstract idea, such as all sentient beings. And we can even potentially experience that, my research shows, we can experience that in a more holistic way. We can experience compassion for oneself and others simultaneously. So we acknowledge that there's shared suffering in the world, that there are aspects of the human experience that we all share in together, and we can experience compassion for all of that. So now that I've gone over this definition at a more conceptual level, I'd like for us to see if we can kind of experience this definition ourselves, try out these three different aspects. Notice that I have this kind of cycle depicted here on the screen, and that's because really ultimately these are not separable aspects. They feed into one another. One may lead, others may follow, but it's more of a cycle, and we experience this over time through practice as a more holistic kind of experience. So compassion, and we know this from research, is an innate emotion. It's something natural to us. So even though these are kind of the ingredients of compassion, we can think of it that way, ingredients of the recipe, the experience itself is a more emergent thing, and we are able to experience it more holistically over time. One way that I like to think about that is it's a bit like riding a bike, where at the beginning, as we're learning to ride the bike, there's these kind of different aspects that maybe feel a little bit clunky, like how do these all come together and fit together? And same with other skills. And then over time, it becomes a more holistic and integrated experience. So as a way for preparing for this, I want you to reflect on this question here. Is there something that sparks inner warmth for you? Something that you can call to mind that readily brings about this kind of natural affection and care. Sometimes people, this is a more somatic thing, they might want to put their hand on their heart, and that naturally brings about this inner warmth for them. But there are other ways as well. And so I'll share my own sort of spark here, or one of my sparks. On the left here, you see this puppy is my brother's new puppy. He sent me photos a few weeks back. And so this is the puppy rolling around in the grass with its belly up. And when I think about this puppy, I feel this natural care and affection. I want the puppy to have a good life and to not suffer. And so maybe for you, it's a kitten if you're more of a cat person, but a pet is a fair game thing here. It doesn't have to be another human being. And it might seem kind of silly to focus on a pet or to think about an animal to spark our warmth or care for ourselves or others. But research shows that people actually do have a little bit easier time. They tend to have a little bit easier time feeling this warmth and affiliation with pets and with animals. And that's especially true when you compare this across from adults to animals. People have a harder time feeling this kind of natural warmth for human adults. in comparison to animals. They have an easier time with children, so maybe you could think of a child as well. So just giving you a moment, some space here. Is there something that you know of that sparks this warmth for you, this natural warmth and care? Okay, now that you've identified that, we're going to do our first step of the compassion practice now. So I'll invite you to get into a posture where you feel comfortable, kind of experiencing, trying this out within your own experience. Oftentimes in meditation, we think of this as an upright, more upright posture. It just helps us feel the sense of wakefulness. And I find that it also helps me feel the sense of warmth and care to have this kind of firm back and open, soft front of an upright posture. And if you'd like, you could close your eyes, but it's not necessary. You can keep your eyes open as well. And we're going to go through these different aspects of compassion that we've talked about conceptually, explore them in our own experience. And at a certain point in this process, I'm going to ask you to recall your spark, to bring that spark to mind, to help you cultivate this feeling for. So that was the intention here. So this first aspect of this on-the-spot compassion practice, and we're going to apply this first to ourselves in this first exercise, is to notice any suffering. So to allow ourselves to open to the experience of suffering within ourselves in this moment. Now, what do I mean by suffering? Well, a Buddhist translation of suffering, which is the tradition that's most strongly informed a scientific understanding of compassion, is this kind of dissatisfaction with our experience. So it's not that suffering has to be suffering with a big S. There's lots of little s kind of suffering. So it's not just like trauma or something like that. It can be a little thing, like some pain in my lower back or shoulders, something like that from working too much on my computer, some discomfort, some sense of wanting to be somewhere other than where I am right now. That too is a kind of suffering, according to this understanding. So tuning in and seeing if you can notice suffering. Seeing if we can empathize with ourselves. What is that like? To allow ourselves to feel with ourselves, to let that pain in. This being said, if it gets too intense for you at any point, just know that you could do a simple mindfulness practice during this. This isn't going to last too long. We'll return back to conceptual content in a bit. But if you're willing, staying with this experience of suffering, what does it feel like? Is there resistance within us? Is there some part of us that doesn't want to open in this way? Okay, and now the second aspect is where we're going to bring in our spark. Okay, so for a moment, allowing that noticing of suffering to be let go of, and instead taking a moment to call to mind this thing or this putting our hand on our heart or whatever it is that helps you spark this warmth. So I'm now thinking of a puppy, bringing that to mind, feeling for that other being. And now allowing this spark to grow, sort of fanning the flames, so to speak, through our breath. And then reorienting this feeling. Once we feel grounded in this quality of warmth, reorienting back toward ourself, toward our own experience of suffering. Seeing if we can allow this warmth to hold this suffering within a bigger container of care and natural affection. At any point, if we lose touch with this warmth, we can remember the spark, come back to that. And then reorient back toward ourselves, toward our own experience of pain and suffering. And then we have this final step, which is to join this with a wish. What wish do you have for yourself, for the suffering that you're noticing? Traditional language here is, may I be free from this suffering. So maybe that works for you. But it could be more specific. May I have a greater sense of trust. Here the focus is not on changing our experience in the now, although that may happen. That might be a nice side effect of this wish. But instead we're wishing for our suffering to change over the long term, if possible. We don't even necessarily have to see how this is possible. This isn't about fixing or solving problems. This is instead about cultivating that willingness, that readiness, if the opportunity arises to alleviate our suffering, if there are ways that we can act to reduce the suffering in ourselves, that we're willing to do so, that we have this wish cultivated. So again, see if there's a unique wish you can ask of yourself in this moment. May I have some relief. Okay. Thank you for trying this out with me. Hopefully you were able to touch in to this experience of compassion a little bit. And I want to note that this process, this is a practice, this is a training, this is part of training. And we offer these trainings through Naropa. I think the links will be shared in the chat with you. There's a couple of courses. We have an upcoming training course that's a more advanced compassion training that has to do with Tonglen, which is a traditional practice of sending and taking, is the translation of that, where we work with the more energetic level of compassion. And we also have a more introductory level of compassion training that's available through a partnership with Mindful Magazine. And that link will also be shared. It's also available on my website, jordanqualia.com. So these trainings help us transform the subconscious experience of empathy into a more conscious experience. How is it that we do that? Well, all of these elements involve engagement with processes that are important to conscious experience more broadly. When we grow in awareness of suffering, we are increasing attention. We're paying more attention, and attention is a really important aspect of conscious experience. When we feel for another, we're engaging certain social systems that are more conscious than the experience sharing that happens empathically, which tends to be more subconscious. And then that final component of wishing, or that intentional conative aspect. Intention is another key aspect of conscious experience. Anytime that intention is in the mix, we as psychologists tend to think of that as a more conscious experience. So the result of a more conscious form of empathy is a more regulated form of empathy. Because by definition, emotion regulation, or regulation more broadly, is essentially our conscious experience being able to modify or modulate to work with what's coming up in a more subconscious kind of way. Okay, and ultimately, this more regulated state, this more conscious form of compassion, is not just on the side of emotional connection or just on the side of emotional autonomy, but rather it's something that allows us to experience connection and containment simultaneously. So as an empath, if we train in this capacity, there's this possibility for us to transform our experience of being an empath in a way that allows us to preserve what we like about that aspect of ourselves, what we experience as the strength of that aspect of ourselves, to retain our intuitive abilities and so on, our ability to connect with others and so on, and to also decrease and lessen the kind of suffering that can come from experiencing an excess of empathy, right? So I like to think of it, if we have high empathy, we have this greater opportunity for the cultivation of compassion and this greater opportunity potentially to enact change at this level within ourselves and within the world. So those same steps that we went through earlier with regard to ourself and our own suffering, we can also try this out in the future, sparking warmth and so on, but applying it toward the suffering that we're encountering in the world as well. So I think I'll pause here. I think it's not a bad time to take a break and to open this up and bring Jim back on, and we'll have a little dialogue. I do have a bit more that I could share if there's interest in that, and we'll just see what comes up.
Thank you so much, Jordan. Now, just before we launch in, the other parts that you might share, does that cover new ground? What does that cover?
I would just say it's another opportunity for us to think about this distinction between empathy and compassion. So I wouldn't say that it covers whole new ground. Yeah, it's more like another way of thinking about it.
Okay, well, there's been a number of chats, so let's kind of dive in. You're really opening up some nuances in our understanding. We use these words: suffering, compassion, empathy, love, faith, hope, rather easily, but to really define them in a precise way is very, very challenging. So this has been very helpful. I'd like to start at the beginning of your remarks around this national decline in empathy that seems to be directly correlated with the rise of, divisive politics in the United States. And, it's a kind of a chicken or the egg. And I would just sort of love your comments on the relationship between the politics of division, really instigated during the Reagan administration, that have been with us in an increasingly exacerbated way through Donald Trump, and this decrease in empathy. Would just love your quick comments. And then also, is there any data showing the rise or fall of empathy globally?
To my knowledge, to that second piece, that's relatively simple. To my knowledge, no. I've tried to look more into this decline, and so I haven't found that. Another piece that I'll point to that maps pretty closely on this decline is the rise in the internet and technology use. And so I think that's another important factor here. The role of being separated through screens and not experiencing many of the natural cues that we might ordinarily experience to let us know that others are experiencing pain to something we say, for example. So I think that's an important piece. I think that it contributes, actually, technology contributes to this growing divide, in the sense that we're able to say something mean, for example, to someone else, and to not experience vicariously the downside of that, because we say something and then it just sits there, and the other person on the receiving end, ordinarily in a discussion, we would have to then relate to the reaction to that experience. And so the internet allows for people to leave a comment or say something kind of offhanded without ending up experiencing the downsides of that. So I think that's part of it. Other empathy researchers do point to what you're saying, which is this growing polarization in American politics as being a suspect in this, in explaining this decline in empathy. And I, for that reason, suspect that we would continue to see this decline in empathy nationally if we were to look at that based on this increase in polarization. An aspect of empathy research that's really relevant here has to do with dehumanization. So when we engage in a kind of us versus them dynamic, we experience less of that initial component of empathy I discussed, which was called mind perception. So when we make someone into an other, like you're a conservative and I'm a liberal or whatever it is, then there is this decrease. We sort of dial down how much of a mind we're imputing on that other. We decrease the amount of interiority of that other within our own experience in ways that decrease the other kinds of empathy as well, experience sharing and mentalizing and so on. So my suspicion with regard to your question is that mind perception, due to this us versus them dynamic, is a real driver of this decrease in other kinds of empathy over time, because we're doing this sort of more tribal, pre-conscious thing of decreasing the amount that we're saying this other person is alive and is a human and has an interior experience and so on.
Well, it's interesting, and I wanted to probe it because, Arnold Toynbee, in his masterful study of history, where he examined 23 of the extant civilizations that at least we know about, and was really looking at how they rise and how they fall. He says that one of the characteristics of the fall of a society or a nation, or certainly a civilization, which was his principal focus of study, is the loss of what he calls civic engagement. That at a certain point, at sort of an apogee moment of power and wealth, people replace civic engagement with personal entitlement. And that is just a natural process of the decline and fall of imperial systems, civilizations, nations, societies, communities. You can see it in microscopic ways in a marriage or in a civilization or an empire. And I think that's worth just contemplating, that this loss of empathy in the United States may be corresponding with many, many other factors. But as a key indicator, we're losing our capacity for what Toynbee says. He says it's civic engagement that actually allows a community, nation, civilization, what he calls the elasticity to deal with challenges. But when you lose that basic empathy for your fellow citizen, the institution loses its capacity to respond creatively to challenges. I would love to. I want to just bring that into the conversation because it really stimulated me when I saw that graph, and would just love any further comments you would like to make.
Yeah, I very much appreciate that. There's a lot in the mix there. One thing I'll say is sort of compassion as an antidote to that potentially, right? Is that when we cultivate compassion, then we can experience that disconnection when we do encounter it as an invitation to lean in, right? We can actually start to undo this untethering or this social disconnection that you're pointing to, whether it's within our own family systems, our own relationship, or on that sort of more macro level. And I certainly think that you see this, right? That as we sort of become more invested in our own sort of things and even our own devices, right, are having sort of our own news feed and Facebook or whatever it might be, there's this kind of walling off to the rest of the world in ways that would decrease our engagement with it. And I think at the basis of that, there's less of an investment, right, in the societal good, in the good of all. And that has to do with our willingness to engage with suffering that's not our own.
Mm,
And so
mm,
I think that sometimes in modern society, we experience maybe a choosing against empathy because we're encountering so much suffering as well in the world. And so we sort of check out. There's something called the collapse of compassion, which is that when suffering gets to a sufficiently high degree, there's too much of it, people will wall off, they'll collapse, and they will sort of numb out to that experience. And so I think that's also a factor here, right? Whereas if we have compassion instead of just empathy, then there's this more conscious engagement. And I think that that will lead to, as you're pointing to, sort of more civic engagement as well, because civic engagement is one route that we can take to try and decrease suffering or improve the well-being of others, not just ourselves. And of course, at the end of the day, it's also harming us to not engage civically, right? It's this false sort of dichotomy that we create, that we think somehow helping others is not helping ourselves. We've actually fallen into that illusion again and again, right? And our sort of hyper individualistic society makes us or reinforces this narrative that we look out for ourselves only, and that there's some cost to looking out for others. And it couldn't be further from the truth, right? When we actually lean in and we cultivate care and concern and compassion for others within society, especially those who are struggling the most, that benefits us directly. It's not an either or dynamic. And I
yes.
think that's one of the things I love about compassion is that compassion teaches us that caring should feel good. It shouldn't be something that's a costly experience. Civic engagement should not be this thing where we're choosing that instead of, something else that we'd rather be doing. But rather, civic engagement feels good and it provides more fuel for us to engage in the other aspects of our life as well.
Beautifully put. Beautifully put. Well, I have many more questions, and I want to
Please.
circle back to compassion fatigue before we're done.
Yeah.
But I want to bring in a couple of questions, starting with Jane Norton in the chat. That she says that she was told by a chiropractor who uses genetic testing that there is, in fact, an empath gene,
Hmm.
that you can inherit one or not from your parents. He
Yeah.
said that just because someone has the gene doesn't mean that they activate it. Now, what do you know about a
Yeah.
possible empath gene? Is that
Right. Right.
a reality or a fantasy?
Right. So this gets into the heritability or the nature side of empathy. It's important to note that we know from research that empathy isn't a fixed trait. There is malleability. People can increase their amount of empathy. They can potentially train in ways to reduce some empathy. So, but most of the research has been focused, as to my knowledge, on increasing empathy. And so we know that's possible. So it's not just a nature story here. It's also about nurture. It's also about conditioning and learning and training. And I think I might know the gene that they're speaking to. Have done a little bit of genetics research in the past, although not at all an expert in this area. And there is a particular gene that's associated with prosociality. If people have this gene, they're much more likely to help in situations, emergency situations, and so on, versus not having this. They're more likely to turn away and look out for themselves and so on. But that's not the only gene that is regulating this kind of response to situations. And so I try and caution against getting too myopic, too sort of reductionist about just one causal factor, and thinking about instead that there are myriad things that may shape a person's level of empathy and also situational empathy, right? Like why they might choose to engage in empathic or caring behavior in different situations. And so the gene is increasing the likelihood, but it's not the full story there.
Yes, of course, you're right. It's all interconnected. But I'm intrigued by Jane's question in
Yeah.
light of, the research that they've done that, liberals and conservatives actually have different brain architecture.
Mm. Mm.
and different activations of different parts of the brain.
Yeah.
So it may be that you can build your brain tissue, your sort of your muscle tissue
Yes.
around empathy, because the more you practice it, the more your body chemistry, I would imagine, and the hormones and so forth that get activated through just something as simple as heart coherence uh,
Yeah.
practice would start to build that chemical process that makes empathy and compassion easier over time as one continues daily practice.
That's right. Yeah, that's built into the idea of compassion science at the outset, that this is trainable and that our brains are
Yes.
malleable in these ways. Neuroplasticity is the word that's commonly used for this. And I'll say that, as someone who studies this stuff, takes great interest, it's pretty extraordinary just how malleable our brains are, even in adulthood, to training and experience, especially systematic training and experience, and more especially when it's something that we care deeply about, that our brain is much more willing, I think, to allocate the resources to grow and develop in ways consistent with that. There is some studies showing that even 45 minutes of learning a new skill, such as reading Braille or something like that, because in science they try and make it real specific so they can target these effects, does result in structural changes in the brain. So what's happening in the brain here in response to experience is that it is constantly evolving, right? And so if that can happen from 45-minute session, imagine if we took, a few minutes each day, every day, and repeated that process, how much we could transform and grow in our experience of this stuff, even, with or without that gene that might be sort of increasing the likelihood of this in a more natural way.
Yeah. Beautiful. Cindy Beedso is making a comment about the work of Thomas Hubel in terms of social witnessing as a pathway to empathy and compassion.
Mm.
And was just making the point that we have to get creative and in touch with our telepathic and other superhuman powers to really fully activate and maintain empathy.
Mm.
I think that's a notion that's worth exploring because empathy is a communing in some ways, um, external to oneself to another being,
Yeah.
whether it's a puppy, a bird, or your spouse, or a stranger, that
Yeah.
requires a tuning of I would say, the telepathic capacities
Mm.
that are inherent in all of us. Is your research involved in any aspects such as that?
Not like directly. I'm not studying telepathy, although I think there's some good work happening in that space, and I think it's a very fascinating area to follow and track closely. Obviously, a controversial area. I would say that the evidence for those kinds of things is still coming in. There's the jury's still out on a lot of that stuff in terms of being able to reliably study something like that in the laboratory. But I will say that one way that I would sort of frame what you're speaking about is the further reaches, the further potential of this kind of simulation that we do of others within our own experience. That we are on a subconscious level simulating others based on bodily cues, facial expressions, vocal tones, and so on. And that what might happen if we develop that to such a sufficient degree, that can we get so exquisitely tuned to the bodily cues, the facial expressions, and so on of others that there is this almost telepathic like quality. That might be one way that I explain it in a more materialist sort of scientific framework. But then there are, of course, explorations of this topic happening from different angles, like understanding other ways that we might be receiving information other than that sort of more physical or measurably physical process. And so I think that that's really exciting to think about sort of other means that we might be taking in information.
Yes, that's a good point. And David Stoney makes an additional point in this regard that, it was experience sharing
Yeah.
which was a very important component in our early ancestors, what, Marseille Eliade calls the participation mystique,
Mm.
that ritual,
Yeah.
that group bonding
Yeah.
was generated out of our capacity to mystically participate as an individual in the larger whole.
Yeah.
And I think that's another aspect of empathy, that just think of, going to church and participating in the mass,
Hmm.
or going through a bar mitzvah, or doing the Hajj,
Yeah.
where you actually circumnavigate the Kaaba with millions and millions of other people. Marseille
Yeah.
Eliade said that participation mystique is at the heart of spiritual and religious
Mm-hmm.
bonding.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, and as a scientist, one way that I think about that is the primary ecology that humans adapted to wasn't a physical ecology. We're not like fish that adapted to swimming in the ocean exclusively or something like that. Or we're not just living in the mountains, but that humans, the primary ecology we adapted to over time and evolved to was the presence of other humans. And so we evolved in groups, we evolved in the presence of others, and it's the exception to the rule when we're by ourselves. So we tend to think of being by ourselves as sort of the norm, and then other people come in the mix, and now we've got this other dynamic. But it's the opposite, right? The
Yeah,
exception is when we're by ourselves. And so when you increase that in mass, like you're speaking about, there's something so spiritual about that experience, isn't there? To be able to resonate with collectively with many, many people. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And Dahana Rice is making a simple point, putting it spatially, that isn't it a matter of just keeping our space broad enough and expanded enough so that we feel the hearts of others, and that
Mm,
the stresses that we get from the environment actually compel us to constrain.
mm,
So it's empathy is also a matter of, again, that participation mystique,
yeah,
the capacity to stay open and aware consciously of our connections with all of the beings around us, the larger eco field, and resisting the the temptation, I think you would say, of contracting and
yeah,
constraining under stressful stimuli.
that's right. Yeah, there's a kind of, in modern society, I like to frame it this way, there's a kind of rejection of our natural interdependence. And we see this play out, economically, we see this play out socially in various ways. And we suffer for it because it's innate for us to resonate with others. There is a biological imprint of our interdependence that, as I talked about, is irrepressible. And so when we close down to that experience, we're trying to effortfully avoid our own nature. And so when we're sort of swimming against the stream in that way, we're creating inner conflict that maybe is something that is exacerbated and reinforced in us over time.
Yeah, yeah. Well, we're running out of time, so I
Yeah,
want to
yeah,
just ask you um, first about this compassion fatigue, because we are hearing on the news, particularly last fall and into the winter, and with the hospitals being full, all over the world, actually, that the frontline practitioners were experiencing pandemic fatigue.
yes,
And I'm just wondering what your comment is about, can you have empathy fatigue, compassion fatigue, pandemic fatigue? All of
yeah,
us are just fatigued. And
yeah,
in the reason why I think this is worth exploring, uh, Jordan, is because all of us are experiencing fatigue right now
yeah,
with the pandemic. All of us, we've been cramped in our houses. We're engaging in social interactions we're not used to over long periods of time right now. It's one thing to be in lockdown and isolation for a week or a month. We've been
yeah,
at it for over a year. And there's all kinds of data, as you know, that are indicating that the basic fabric of human relatedness is corroded corroded
Yeah.
by the lockdowns and physical distancing and mask wearing, and as necessary as those have been in order
Yeah.
to prevent the spread of the pandemic. So speak to us a little bit about the nature of fatigue,
Yeah.
and what would you recommend for those of us that are feeling this compassion pandemic fatigue? What are ways through this? What are some practices we can engage in that will empower us to be more empathetic when all around us we're being given the stimulus to close down?
Yeah. Yeah, I so appreciate the question and the context that you put that in this broader context. There's a couple of things I'll say. One is that we know from research, just as I was saying, that the primary ecology that humans evolved into was an ecology of being surrounded by other beings. So feeling that connection and being reinforced in community. And so when there's less of that, which there I think naturally is in this time, even if we have close friendships and we're talking on the phone and we're having Zoom calls and so on, there's still less of the energetic benefit that we get from being surrounded by others. And so even introverts, this isn't just for extroverts in terms of getting energy from others, being surrounded by others. This is true, I think, of almost all human beings, is this idea that there is an energetic efficiency that happens when we're surrounded by others. And researchers have studied this in terms of the brain resources needed to accomplish an emotion regulation task is actually less when we're with a close other than it is when we're by ourselves. And that, so it's not just that it's the close other is allowing us to do more of what we're already doing. It's actually lessening the burden that the brain has to accomplish that same task. So there's an increase in efficiency, metabolic efficiency, when we're surrounded by others. And so in this environment of the pandemic, we're having less of that energy efficiency available. And so it's just harder every day to complete some of the tasks mentally and socially and so on that we might normally have an easier time with. And so that contributes over time to this kind of fatigue. And then I would say that there's also empathy fatigue happening sort of more, especially for those of us who are caring and paying attention and so on, but even for those of us that aren't. I mean, you go to the grocery store and suffering is in your face. It's unavoidable. You see people in the masks, you're avoiding each other. There's more effort in that process and so on. Ordinarily, as a society, and I'm not saying this is good, but ordinarily, what we're used to is sweeping suffering under the rug. You go to the grocery store, people have their best face on, and you see somebody say hello and so on. Usually, it's kind of that kind of experience. Whereas now you go and there's this reminder, it's in your face that we are living through a global pandemic. That, for many of us, is going to naturally draw on our empathy, and it's going to be then more chronically engaged. We're going to be living in a state of sort of chronic empathic engagement in a way that if we don't have tools to work with that in a skillful way, and we're trying to avoid the experience, that is going to lead to exhaustion in ways similar to what I said in the talk. So my recommendation, maybe unsurprisingly, is to fit in a little bit of this compassion or heart coherence practice or something similar to that into one's daily routine. The capacity for us to self-initiate a feeling of social connection, that we actually have the capacity to feel that connection even in our own homes, even without community, being right here and now. And that also gives us the resources. It makes us more resourceful when we're in those situations where suffering is present.
Yeah, beautifully put. And Malini Rajendran was just putting in the chat box the importance of making the connection between empathy and peace.
Mm-hmm.
What you're saying to us, Jordan, is that really the antidote to the stresses in which we find ourselves is to pause engage in heart coherence, which is why we do this every day at the beginning of our sessions. It may be the most important practice in the world right now, in an era of lockdown, isolation, and physical distancing, just to attune oneself to one's heart, aware of the heartbeat of others in a spirit of gratitude and thanksgiving, may be one of the most healthy things we can possibly do.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, that's wonderful.
And so I really want to thank you for your time today. And just as a final comment, as you know, empathy and the challenge all of us have to become more empathic.
Yeah.
What single practice or mental disposition of being would you offer us to ponder as we close this discussion and consider how we can become more empathic?
Yeah, I think I shared a little brief practice on the spot, but here's an even briefer one that people might choose to engage in when they're feeling that empathy instinct arise for them, when we're feeling touched, affected by something, is this possibility of inhaling that empathy, actually allowing ourselves that pause to feel what others are feeling. And then not just staying with that in a kind of way that's more passive, but internally allowing ourselves then to radiate out care and to radiate out love and to radiate goodness out in response to that wish for well-being. So what I like to think about is inhale empathy, exhale compassion. There's this receiving and then giving. And so there's this possibility we could do that anytime, anywhere that we feel this activation.
That's beautiful. Inhale empathy and exhale compassion.
That's right.
Inhale the connection and exhale the
Or
love.
connection. Yes, yes.
That's beautiful, Jordan. That
Thanks.
is beautiful. I love the workings of your mind and the openness of your heart today. It's been like the balm of Gilead, as they say in the scriptures. So
Thank you. It's been great being here. Really
very,
appreciate it.
very much. And we welcome everyone to join us in the after session chat. They'll put the link in the chat where we can just engage more informally on these matters. So thank you, Stan, and everyone in the chat action group. And then tomorrow, meaning Monday, we want to build on what Jordan has shared with us today about compassion and empathy. We're going to have a session really on the science of co-creation. Because if you think about it, if you're inhaling empathy and the connection with others and exhaling love and compassion, what that generates is a field. And out of that field, creativity naturally emerges. And that's part of the symbiosis of what it means to be socially interconnected, is that all kinds of creativity is just naturally generated. Just imagine our world if we were all inhaling empathy and exhaling compassion throughout our day. Imagine the creativity that would emerge to solve the problems that currently plague us, because all those quotients are going down. It's painful to contemplate that empathy is on the decline nationally in a dramatic way, probably not just in the United States, but around the world. And so this challenge of connecting again with each other within the context of the larger eco field of nature, of Earth, and out of that, creating, co-creating the future is a really high art form and spiritual practice. So that's what we're going to turn to on Monday. But Jordan, thank you. You've been sublime once
you.
again. and we're all grateful to you. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We'll see you in the after session chat, and we'll see you, most of you, again on Monday, same time, same station, 5 o'clock p.m. Central European Time here on Zoom. Bye, everyone. Have a good weekend. Thanks, Jordan.
Thank you.